Welcome to Valid History. Here, old photos tell real stories from the past. Please subscribe, like, and share to help keep history alive.
Mr. Epstein appears in the 1975 yearbook of the Dalton School, placing him within the institution's documented community at that time, a simple archival record that fixes his presence in a specific educational setting and year without interpretation or elaboration. Lydia Fairchild, seeking child support in 2002, was accused of fraud when DNA tests denied her maternity of her own children, a mystery that ultimately revealed she had absorbed her twin in the womb, whose DNA her children had inherited. For decades, Jimmy Savile was among Britain's most beloved television personalities, but his death in 2011 exposed him as one of the most prolific sexual predators in British history, his celebrated children's show masking crimes that had gone entirely unpunished. Two photographs of Utrecht, Netherlands, taken 44 years apart, document the dramatic physical transformation of a European city between 1982 and 2026. In 1919, crowds gathered on London's streets to observe the very first 2-minute silence, men removing their hats in respect for the fallen of the Great War. The largest surviving capstone of an ancient Egyptian pyramid, nearly 5 tons and dating to around 2600 BC, stands as a tangible remnant of one of history's most extraordinary engineering achievements. A mixed couple poses with their newborn in Saitama, Japan, in 1947, a quiet, intimate moment captured against the backdrop of post-war transformation. In 1999, Serbian forces shot down an American F-117 stealth aircraft, prompting Serbian propaganda to issue a poster reading, "Sorry, we didn't know it was invisible," turning military humiliation into sharp public mockery. On this day in 1931, 23-year-old Indian revolutionary Bhagat Singh was hanged by British colonial authorities, and this photograph remains the last image taken of him alive. Aaron Siskin's street photography captured the everyday life of Harlem in the late 1930s and early 1940s, producing a body of work now recognized as among the most compelling documentary photography of its era. Alice Roosevelt poses around 1902 with her pet parrot, offering a rare glimpse of the private life of one of America's most spirited presidential daughters. 94-year-old Japanese politician Yukio Ozaki was photographed in 1953 after suffering his first electoral defeat, ending a remarkable unbroken run of victories across 25 previous elections. In 1892, a family poses before the felled Mark Twain sequoia, a 1,341-year-old giant standing 331 feet tall, whose removal required 2 men 13 days of continuous sawing to complete. One of the rare photographs of North Korean leader Kim Il-sung meeting Soviet leader Konstantin Chernenko in the 1980s captures the large calcium deposit on the back of Il-sung's head, a feature North Korea routinely concealed by controlling camera angles. Unable to secure an upfront salary for the 1988 comedy Twins, Arnold Schwarzenegger partnered with Danny DeVito and director Ivan Reitman to share 40% of the profits, ultimately earning over $40 million, his highest payout from a single film. On June 4, 1999, 15-year-old Michael Palmer disappeared while cycling with friends, who continued riding unaware he had fallen behind, and only realized he was missing when he never arrived at their designated meeting point. European royalty gathered in Germany in 1899, with Grand Duke Boris Vladimirovich, Grand Duke Ernst of Hesse, Tsar Nicholas II, and 3 other princes photographed together in a rare assembly of the continent's ruling dynasties. A punk and an East Berlin Volkspolizei officer sit side by side on the U-Bahn in 1986, an unremarkable moment of proximity that quietly encapsulates the contradictions of everyday life in the German Democratic Republic. Bill and Hillary Clinton were photographed together in the 1970s, decades before they would become two of the most consequential political figures in modern American history. Guests gathered for a dinner party at New York City's Hotel Astor in 1904, capturing a moment of Gilded Age social life at one of the city's most celebrated establishments. Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Brad Hall were photographed on their wedding day in 1987, years before Louis-Dreyfus rose to become one of the most acclaimed comedic actors in American television history. Central Park in 1933 offers a rare visual document of New York City during the Great Depression, capturing the quiet endurance of the city's most iconic public space amid widespread economic collapse. Jackie Chan was photographed in the early 1990s climbing the Hollywood sign, a characteristically daring image from a performer whose physical fearlessness had already made him a global star. In 2013, 15-year-old Tamar Boggs and a friend witnessed the kidnapping of 5-year-old Jocelyn Rojas, pursued the car on bicycles for 15 minutes, and forced the kidnapper to release the child unharmed. On July 28, 1945, a B-25 bomber crashed into the Empire State Building, photographed here bearing the visible damage of one of the most dramatic peacetime accidents in New York City's history. A maintenance worker descends the main cable of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco in 1947, a striking image of the routine human labor required to maintain one of the world's most celebrated engineering structures. A French postcard from 1913 documents an unusual gathering depicting the tallest, shortest, and largest men in Europe seated together at a card table, framed as a curiosity of physical extremity for a mass audience. Mary Mallon, known as Typhoid Mary, was photographed in 1915 on North Brother Island, New York, where she was quarantined for life after being identified as the first asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever in the United States. 44-year-old Tyrone Power suffered a fatal heart attack on the Madrid set of Solomon and Sheba in 1958, and this photograph, taken as he collapsed, became the last image captured of one of Hollywood's defining leading men. Two lumberjacks pose for a photograph taken 104 years ago, a simple portrait of working men whose labor shaped the industrial economies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Two young girls play music together, an unidentified but quietly affecting image that captures childhood and informal musical tradition in a moment preserved across generations. An abacus seller was photographed on the streets of St. Petersburg around 1860, documenting a moment of everyday commercial life in Imperial Russia at the dawn of photographic documentation. Circus performers George Moore, known as the Living Skeleton, and Fred Howe, known as the Fat Man, were photographed together in 1897, their contrasting physiques displayed as entertainment in the tradition of the Victorian Curiosity show. Photographed in 1900, the smallest shop in London stands as a document of the extreme commercial ingenuity and spatial constraints of urban life at the turn of the 20th century. A bride and groom were photographed in the 1860s, their formal portrait representing the earliest decades of wedding photography, when sitting for a camera was still a rare and deliberate act. A Danish zookeeper waters king penguins on a hot summer day in 1957, a quietly absurd image that captures the practical and sometimes improvised realities of animal care in mid-century Europe. Canadian servicemen constructed an ice rink on the Imjingang River during the Korean War in 1952, playing hockey in northern Gyeonggi-do province as a rare moment of recreation amid active conflict. A trestle bridge under construction in British Columbia, Canada in 1918 documents the scale and ambition of early 20th century infrastructure projects in the rapidly expanding Canadian West. The Ronga Brothers Italian grocery store on a New York City street, photographed in January 1943, captures immigrant commercial life in America during the height of the Second World War. Diego Maradona is photographed in 1982 taking on 6 defenders simultaneously, an image that prefigures the extraordinary individual brilliance that would define one of football's most celebrated careers. Inventor H. Day was photographed in May 1922 wearing headphones connected to a wireless device concealed beneath his top hat, an early and eccentric experiment in wearable communication technology. Italian street musicians were photographed in London in 1877 by John Thompson, capturing one of the city's enduring immigrant communities at work in the street culture of Victorian England. Marlon Brando was photographed on the set of The Wild One in the 1950s, an image that helped establish the rebellious visual iconography that would define his cultural legacy for generations. Riveters work high on the South Tower of the Golden Gate Bridge in 1933, a photograph that documents both the physical danger and industrial precision of constructing one of the 20th century's most iconic structures. The Victory Arch and Flatiron Building stand together in a 1919 New York photograph, capturing the city's formal commemoration of the end of the First World War against the backdrop of its defining early skyline. Taken on September 10, 2001, this photograph of the World Trade Center at sunset became, without anyone knowing, the final image of the towers standing undamaged before the attacks of the following morning. Frank Lentini, born in 1884 with 3 legs, 4 feet, 16 toes, and 2 functioning sets of genitals, lived until 1966, spending much of his life performing as one of the most extraordinary figures in circus history. The Mentawai women of Sumatra undergo a painful initiation ritual in which shamans use a stone blade and hammer to file their teeth into points resembling shark teeth, a practice believed to enhance their attractiveness. 2 photographs of Hiroshima, one taken in 1945 and one in 2020, place the total destruction of atomic bombardment directly beside the fully rebuilt modern city that grew from those ruins across 75 years. Bruce Lee was photographed performing a signature pose on the set of Way of the Dragon, capturing the explosive physical presence and precise martial choreography that made him a defining figure of global cinema. Workers pour the foundation of the Eiffel Tower in 1887, documenting the earliest physical stages of a structure that would become one of the most recognized landmarks in human architectural history. A working-class family was photographed in 1880, their formal portrait offering a rare visual document of domestic life among ordinary people during the latter decades of the 19th century. In 1996, Beck Weathers was left for dead on Everest during the deadliest storm in the mountain's history, and hours after his team called his wife to report him gone, he walked back into camp alive. A sailor in drag was photographed in 1906, an image that reveals the hidden subcultures and quiet acts of social defiance that existed even within the most rigidly traditional institutions of the early 20th century. New York City subway cars blanketed in graffiti in the 1970s became one of the era's most arresting visual documents, capturing both the financial collapse of a city in crisis and the birth of a global street art movement. In 2010, Microsoft employees staged a mock funeral for the iPhone to celebrate the launch of Windows Phone 7, a moment of corporate confidence that history would judge with considerable irony. Mafia chief Salvatore Toto Riina waves casually at onlookers in court after receiving his 3rd life sentence in 1993, a gesture of open defiance from a man who would ultimately accumulate 26 life sentences for ordering dozens of murders. Philip Fraser, a 23-year-old Canadian student, was last seen alive picking up a hitchhiker in Alaska in June 1988. His body later discovered after investigators determined the killer had briefly assumed his identity before vanishing entirely. A woman prepares to extract a child's tooth using pliers in the 1920s, a stark document of the era's improvised approach to dental care in households far removed from professional medical access. A photograph taken in California in 1937 captures a moment of American life during one of the most economically and socially turbulent decades in the nation's history. Photographed atop the Empire State Building in 1930 while still under construction, the image titled Icarus places a solitary human figure against the vertiginous scale of New York City's rising skyline. The opening of Ellis Island in 1892 marked the beginning of one of the most significant episodes in American immigration history, as the station began processing the millions of newcomers who would reshape the nation's identity. A Tennessee family of 7 migratory workers was photographed at their river camp in Sacramento, California in 1935, having traveled between walnuts, tomatoes, peaches, and cannery work in search of survival during the Great Depression. Niagara Falls, frozen solid in 1885, presented one of nature's most extraordinary transformations, converting one of the world's most powerful waterfalls into a landscape of complete and eerie stillness. Visitors are photographed enjoying Niagara Falls in 1957, capturing the falls as a site of post-war American leisure and tourism during one of the most prosperous decades in the nation's history. An aerial photograph of Lower Manhattan taken in 1922 documents the city's dense, already towering skyline just as the great era of skyscraper construction was reaching its most ambitious phase. John DeLorean sits beside one of his stainless steel sports cars at the Earl's Court Motor Fair in London, a photograph that captures the man and machine that would become symbols of both automotive ambition and spectacular corporate failure. Samuel L. Jackson, John Travolta, Harvey Keitel, and Quentin Tarantino were photographed together on the set of Pulp Fiction in 1993, documenting the production of a film that would fundamentally reshape American independent cinema. A gentleman sits, having his hair permed while reading a newspaper in 1925, a quietly comic image that captures the collision of modern vanity culture and everyday leisure in the interwar period. The Art Deco Mercury Streamliner, designed by Henry Dreyfuss and unveiled in Chicago in 1936, represented one of industrial design's most ambitious fusions of aesthetic ambition and functional engineering. Hollowed-out logs served as dining and sleeping quarters for logging crews in the Pacific Northwest, a functional improvisation that reveals the raw, transient living conditions of industrial timber work. A window washer works outside a New York City building in the 1950s, suspended high above the street in a photograph that captures the dangerous and largely invisible labor behind the city's gleaming vertical facades. The Black Sunday dust storm of April 14, 1935, documented here in a single overwhelming image, was the largest storm of the Dust Bowl era, a catastrophe that drove hundreds of thousands from their homes across the American plains. Mount St. Helens was photographed on May 17, 1980, a single day before the volcanic eruption that killed 57 people and sent shockwaves across Washington state. George Bush, age 5, poses with his sister Nancy in 1929, a family photograph taken nearly 2 decades before he would begin the political career that would eventually lead him to the presidency. William Roentgen demonstrates X-ray technology to an audience in Omaha in 1898, just 3 years after his discovery had transformed medical science and earned him the first Nobel Prize in Physics. Coast Guard officers seize illegal alcohol shipments off the coast of Freeport, New York, during Prohibition in the 1920s, a routine enforcement photograph from an era defined by the systematic and widely defied ban on alcohol. Paul Gauguin was photographed playing the harmonium without trousers in 1895, an image that captures the deliberate eccentricity and social nonconformity of one of post-impressionism's most unconventional figures. A French woman who lived to 122 years old and died in 1997 was in her youth personally acquainted with Vincent van Gogh, having sold him colored pencils as a young girl in Arles. A young girl buys a balloon from a street vendor in Berlin in 1935. Friedrich Seidenstucker's photograph, preserving a moment of ordinary childhood joy in a city already descending into the shadow of National Socialism. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini stepped off a plane at Tehran's Mehrabad airport on February 1, 1979, returning from exile to lead the Islamic revolution that ended the Shah's monarchy and established the theocratic Islamic Republic of Iran. The Convair Model 118 flying car, tested in 1947, demonstrated a workable concept drive to an airfield, attached the wings, take off, but a crash and prohibitive costs ended the project and consigned it to history's catalog of near futures. The top of the Empire State Building was originally engineered not as an observation deck but as a docking station for airships, a vision of aerial urban infrastructure that was technically realized but never practically used. During the First World War, soldiers wore custom-fitted facial prosthetics to conceal severe wounds and disfigurements, an early form of reconstructive aid that allowed men to re-enter civilian life with some degree of restored appearance. Osceola McCarty, a washerwoman who left school in the 6th grade and worked her entire life, donated $300,000 to the University of Southern Mississippi in 1995 to fund scholarships for low-income students. A Navajo girl wearing traditional silver and turquoise squash blossom jewelry was photographed in 1950, capturing both the artisanal heritage of Navajo silverwork and the enduring cultural identity it represented. By the 12th century, Bologna had built approximately 180 towers within its city limits, the tallest of which still stands today at 97 meters, surviving as the most dramatic remnant of medieval urban competition. A young woman surveys a Nevada canyon from the rim in 1931, a quiet document of American landscape photography from the depths of the Great Depression. On July 28, 1945, a B-25 bomber crashed into the Empire State Building, a wartime accident that killed 14 people and left visible structural damage on one of New York's most iconic skyscrapers. School children line up for free soup and bread during the Great Depression in the 1930s, a photograph that captures the mass child poverty produced by the most severe economic collapse in modern American history. A family was photographed in Alaska in the early 1900s, a portrait that documents domestic life on the American frontier at the extreme northern edge of the continent during the final years before statehood. Wilt Chamberlain, 17 years old, was photographed in 1954, capturing a glimpse of the man whose physical dimensions and athletic dominance would redefine professional basketball within the decade. Two individuals are presented as innocent souls from an earlier time, a minimal description that situates them in the past while emphasizing their perceived innocence, offering no further identifying detail beyond this brief and generalized characterization. A roadside camper uses an auto tent in 1920, an image that documents the earliest years of American road trip culture, when the automobile began transforming how ordinary people moved through and experienced the landscape. A figure waits alone in a public space in 1920, a simple photograph that captures the universal and timeless human experience of anticipation in an era when waiting had no alternative. On April 15, 1865, just 6 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox effectively ended the Civil War, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, and 4 days later the nation mourned as his funeral procession moved down Pennsylvania Avenue. The San Francisco earthquake of April 18, 1906, leveled 90% of the city, left 225,000 people homeless, killed at least 3,000, and left behind $10 billion in destruction captured in stark photographic record. Taken less than 1 second after ignition on January 28, 1986, this photograph of the Space Shuttle Challenger reveals gray smoke escaping from the right solid rocket booster's failed O-ring, the mechanical cause of a disaster that killed 7 crew members. A 1,930 German collector's card imagines people of the future wearing portable wireless headsets during meals to see and speak with friends in real time, an eerily prescient vision of personal communication technology still 30 years from realization. For the 1,999 film Star Wars Episode I, model maker Michael Lynch hand-cut and painted 450,000 cotton swabs and arranged them to simulate cheering stadium crowds, their movement produced by fans placed beneath the set. In September 2004, Paris police discovered a fully equipped secret cinema beneath the city's catacombs, complete with seating for 20, professional wiring, a stocked bar, and adjoining dining rooms installed without any official knowledge. Saddam Hussein touches the black stone of the Kaaba during Islamic pilgrimage in the 1980s, publicly performing religious devotion despite leading Iraq's Ba'ath Party, a regime ideologically rooted in secular Arab nationalism. In April 1944, Sewell Avery, CEO of Montgomery Ward, was physically removed from his office by Army National Guard soldiers after he refused to comply with the National War Labor Board, his company subsequently seized by the U.S. War Department. Passengers aboard United Flight 93 on September 11, 2001, learned from phone calls that hijacked planes had already struck the World Trade Center and launched a revolt that forced the aircraft down in rural Pennsylvania, killing all 44 aboard but preventing its intended target from being struck. School children play inside their Iowa classroom in 1892, a document of rural American education in the final decade of the 19th century, when schoolrooms served as the primary social and intellectual institution of small-town life. A girl's first day of school in Pocahontas County, West Virginia in 1921 was captured in a photograph that documents the early expansion of public education into the rural American communities of the post-war era. Cow shoes designed to disguise human footprints as animal tracks were used by Prohibition-era moonshiners in 1922, a practical and inventive measure to evade law enforcement during America's failed experiment with alcohol prohibition. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, paraded up Fifth Avenue on February 17, 1919, returning from the First World War as one of the most decorated American units in the conflict, welcomed home by the Harlem community they represented. A painting created in 1350 at the Visoki Dechani Monastery in Kosovo depicts a personified comet among the crucifixion scene, an early artistic rendering of celestial phenomena within medieval religious iconography. A shoebill that survived the bombing of the Berlin Zoo was photographed in 1945, being cared for by its keeper in her personal bathroom, one of the stranger and more affecting documents of civilian life in the city's final wartime months. Attendees of a 1,992 serial killers convention at Circus Circus, photographed by Jim Gerzinski, present a document of a distinctly American subculture built around fascination with criminal history and the darker corridors of true crime. Extreme skier Doug Coombs descends a nearly vertical slope in 1989, a photograph that captures the radical edge of a sport then pushing the boundaries of what was considered physically survivable on snow. The construction of the Titanic was photographed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, documenting the assembly of a vessel whose maiden voyage in 1912 would end in one of the most catastrophic maritime disasters in history. Construction of the Golden Gate Bridge in the 1930s was photographed at a stage when the emerging structure's scale was already apparent, capturing the physical ambition of a project that would redefine both engineering and the San Francisco skyline. 12,500-year-old cave paintings discovered in the Amazon represent one of the oldest known examples of human artistic expression in the Americas, their survival in a tropical environment making them among the most remarkable archaeological finds of the modern era.